It was the 26th of June, 1897, and New York City was in the grip of a suffocating summer heat. The streets of Manhattan shimmered, the air thick with the familiar smells of coal smoke, horse manure, and the rank breath of the East River at low tide. Pushcart vendors called their wares along the avenues, factory whistles sounded across the tenement rooftops, and the city, loud, relentless, and perpetually crowded, went about its daily business. In the working-class districts of the West Side, men and women rose before dawn to attend to their labours. Boarding houses filled to capacity on the long summer nights, their rooms let to tradesmen, labourers, and immigrants who had crossed the Atlantic in search of something more than the old world had offered them. German voices mingled with those of a dozen other tongues in the corridors and kitchens of Ninth Avenue. Life, for most, was a matter of endurance. But on this particular morning, along the riverbank near East 11th Street, something had been found in the water, something that would arrest the attention of an entire city, command the front pages of the great rival newspapers for months to come, and draw back a curtain upon a love triangle of extraordinary and fatal consequence. William Guldensuppe was a man whom those who knew him described as powerfully built, handsome, and about 40 years of age. He was employed as a rubber, that is to say, a masseur, at the Murray Hill Turkish Baths on West 42nd Street, one of the more respectable bathing establishments in the city. His colleagues saw him almost daily in a state of partial undress, and were intimately familiar with the particular markings of his person, including a tattoo upon his chest, the souvenir of earlier years spent at sea. His origins were the subject of some disagreement in the press. Some accounts described him as a German immigrant, others held that he was Turkish. What the records do confirm is that he had resided for some year and a half at a boarding house at 439 Ninth Avenue, a property managed by a woman named Mrs. Augusta Nack. The two had made little effort to conceal the nature of their relationship, and the neighbours on Ninth Avenue had long since ceased to regard it with any particular surprise. Augusta Nack was herself a woman of striking appearance and formidable character. Born on the 5th of April 1860 in a village in what was then the Prussian province of Pomerania, a region now belonging to present-day Germany, she had spent her girlhood in the rural rhythms of a farming family. Her father worked the land and kept geese and chickens, and Augusta assisted him in those duties until his early death left the family in considerably reduced circumstances. When she was 11 years of age, she went into domestic service for a gentleman of the village, rising before dawn to labour in the kitchen and about the farm. At 18, she departed for the city of Kiel on the Baltic Sea, where she entered domestic service once more for a prosperous family. It was there that she met Hermann Nack, and after a courtship of some months, the two were married. Children came, a boy and a girl, and for a time the family maintained some degree of stability. Germany, however, was not a country at ease with itself. The depression that had taken hold in 1873 had driven down the prices of both agricultural and industrial goods for the better part of a decade. Corporations failed, rural communities contracted. Emigration became, for hundreds of thousands of Prussian families, not merely a hope, but a necessity. By the 1880s, it was estimated that nearly 1.5 million Germans had departed for the Americas. Hermann and Augusta Nack were among them. Tragedy had preceded their departure. Their young son had died. They sailed for New York with their surviving daughter. In the city, through considerable effort, they established a delicatessen on 10th Avenue, and for a time it appeared that their fortunes had turned. Then their daughter died as well, at the age of 4. Augusta was said to have been wholly devastated by the loss. Hermann, for his part, began drinking, returning to the shop in states of intoxication, spending the profits and rendering the business untenable. Augusta, by her own account, eventually dismissed him from her life entirely. Alone in the city, she applied whatever nursing knowledge she had acquired in Germany and established herself as a midwife, setting up in premises from which she could conduct that trade. It was in this capacity, as landlady, midwife, and a woman of considerable independence, that she came to let rooms to working men on 9th Avenue, and it was in this capacity that William Guldensuppe came under her roof. Into the arrangement at 9th Avenue there entered, in the course of time, a third figure, a barber named Martin Thorne. Thorne had been born Martin Torzewski in Germany and had departed his homeland approximately 17 years before the events in question. He was, by all accounts, a dapper and smooth-mannered individual, the sort of man newspapers of the day were disposed to describe as a typical stage barber. He took a room at Mrs. Nack's property and paid her $2 a week in rent. Thorne later testified that at first he believed William Guldensuppe to be Mrs. Nack's husband. In time, he came to understand that this was not so. The relationship between Thorne and Mrs. Nack deepened. Guldensuppe, it appears, was not long in discovering the nature of this new arrangement. The consequences were swift and severe. According to the account later given by Thorne to a fellow barber named John Gotha, Guldensuppe returned home one evening to find Thorne in circumstances that admitted of no innocent interpretation. A violent altercation followed, in which Guldensuppe, being the considerably more powerful of the two men, inflicted upon Thorne a beating of such severity that Thorne was obliged to seek medical attention. It was noted by colleagues at the barber shop on 75th Street, where he was then employed, that he subsequently appeared for his duties with a pair of black eyes. He was discharged from that position when he could not adequately account for his condition. Thorne relocated to premises on 3rd Avenue and 21st Street. Mrs. Nack, it was said, visited him there in secret, providing him with funds and expressing her desire to leave Guldensuppe and establish a life with Thorne instead. In February of 1897, an earlier confrontation between the two men had apparently occurred, in which Thorne produced a pistol and attempted to fire upon Guldensuppe. The masseur had overpowered him and taken the weapon away. The precise chronology of events that followed is known in its broad outline. On or around the 20th of June, Mrs. Nack and Thorne, travelling together under the assumed name of Mr. and Mrs. F. Braun, took the 34th Street ferry across to Long Island, and inspected a small cottage for let at 346 2nd Street, Woodside. They were satisfied with what they found. Mrs. Nack paid $15 as a first month's deposit. A pistol and a knife had by this time been procured by Thorne for a specific and declared purpose. The oilcloth, red with a decorative gold pattern, was purchased shortly thereafter. On the morning of Saturday, the 26th of June, 1897, a group of boys were at play near the pier at East 11th Street, when they noticed in the river a package wrapped in the distinctive red and gold oilcloth. The bundle contained the upper torso and arms of a well-built adult male. The discovery was reported to the authorities, and the remains were conveyed to the High Bridge mortuary. Later that same day, a separate parcel, similarly wrapped, was recovered near the Brooklyn Navy Yard by two boys who had been swimming in the vicinity. It contained 2 human legs. The following morning, a gentleman named Julius Mayer, who had taken his young sons out to gather fruit near the farmlands of the Bronx, found yet another package propped against a retaining wall. The smell, the children reported, was immediately apparent. Mr. Mayer instructed his sons to locate a constable at once. Officers Andrew Brunner and Thomas Farley arrived, examined the contents of the bundle, and summoned a patrol wagon to convey the remains to the High Bridge police station. The assembled portions of the body were examined by the deputy police coroner, who concluded that all of the parts belonged to a single individual, a well-built male, approximately 5 feet and 10 inches in height, and estimated to be around 35 years of age. The coroner further observed that the body bore evidence of stab wounds, including one to the chest cavity, and that death had occurred no more than 36 hours prior to the discovery of the first parcel. The coroner also expressed the opinion that the person who had performed the dismemberment possessed some degree of training, whether surgical or otherwise, in such matters. The red and gold oilcloth proved to be an immediate point of interest. Investigators determined that only 2 wholesale companies in New York City supplied material of this particular pattern. Detectives set about the work of contacting all retailers who stocked it, a laborious undertaking that would eventually yield a most significant result. No head had been found. The identification of the deceased was, at this stage, entirely uncertain. The press had already seized upon the matter. The New York World and the New York Journal, rival papers owned by Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst respectively, devoted considerable column space to the mystery, dispatching reporters to the morgue, the police stations, and the riverside. One correspondent from the World, having spent a long and fruitless night working the case, stopped in at the Murray Hill Turkish Baths on 42nd Street for refreshment, and there overheard 2 employees speaking in hushed tones about a colleague who had not appeared for work in several days. His name was William Guldensuppe. Frank Gartner, an attendant at the Murray Hill Baths, who had seen Guldensuppe in a state of near undress on almost every working day, was escorted to the High Bridge mortuary, along with several of his colleagues. The body, it should be noted, had been subjected to deliberate efforts at concealment beyond the mere act of dismemberment. The head had been severed, a substantial section of flesh had been excised from the chest, removing what colleagues confirmed had been a prominent tattoo, the face of a former sweetheart, dating to Guldensupp's time at sea. Despite this, Gartner identified the remains without hesitation, citing distinctive physical features known to him from years of daily acquaintance. The other bath attendants were equally certain. To confirm the identification beyond all reasonable doubt, Dr. J. S. Cosby of 215 West 44th Street was called upon to examine the left hand of the deceased. Dr. Cosby had previously treated Guldensuppe for an abscess upon the index finger of that hand, the treatment having left a permanent scar upon the digit. He examined the finger carefully and confirmed without reservation that the scar was the very one produced by his own lancet. The identity of the deceased was established. The post-mortem examination had determined that the cause of death was consistent with a gunshot wound to the back of the head, followed by further violence inflicted while the victim yet breathed. The dismemberment, the coroner observed, had been conducted with instruments consistent with those of a man who had at some point received instruction in surgical or anatomical procedure, an observation that would later assume considerable significance when a witness testified that Martin Thorne had spoken of having undergone a course of surgical training in Germany. A carving knife, a saw, and a revolver were subsequently recovered from the cottage at Woodside. Each bore traces of human blood. If you are finding this case as compelling as we do, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps us continue researching and presenting these stories from history. We read every comment left below, so do let us know your thoughts on the case thus far. Now, let us continue with the investigation. Investigators traced the sale of the red and gold oilcloth to a store operated by a couple named Max Rieger and his wife, who positively identified Mrs. Augusta Nack as the woman who had purchased it from their premises. Neighbours at the Woodside cottage identified the same woman as Mrs. Braun. A man named John Gother, a barber of the city, came forward to inform Acting Inspector O'Brien that he had received, in direct conversation, a detailed confession of the crime from Martin Thorne himself. Mrs. Nack was already in custody. Thorne was found and apprehended in Harlem. On the 2nd of July 1897, formal charges of murder in the first degree were laid against Mrs. Augusta Nack. A similar charge was entered against Martin Thorne several days thereafter. The first trial, that of Mrs. Augusta Nack, was held on Long Island and drew an audience of remarkable proportions. The courtroom reserved no fewer than 72 dedicated seats for members of the press, and 10 separate telegraph lines were installed to ensure that the proceedings could be communicated to the public with the utmost speed. The newspapers of New York and of the nation gave the matter prominent and sustained coverage. The prosecution argued that Mrs. Nack had participated in the murder of William Guldensuppe and had conspired with Martin Thorne in the disposal of his remains. Among the evidence presented were the testimony of Max Rieger and his wife, confirming the sale of the oilcloth to Mrs. Nack, the testimony of multiple witnesses who placed both Mrs. Nack and Thorne at the Woodside cottage, and the written confession attributed to Thorne in which he stated that Mrs. Nack had shot Guldensuppe. The defence was conducted by William F. Howe of the prominent New York firm Howe and Hummel, who maintained that Mrs. Nack was herself a victim, a woman who had lived in fear of both Guldensuppe and Thorne, and who had exercised no agency in the events that had resulted in the former's death. Mrs. Nack denied having fired the shot, laying the entire responsibility upon Thorne. As the proceedings advanced, however, she accepted a reduced charge of manslaughter in the first degree and agreed to testify against her co-accused. She was sentenced to 15 years at hard labour to be served at Auburn Prison. She was conveyed there in January of 1898. The trial of Martin Thorne followed and proved no less sensational. William F. Howe, appearing once again for the defence, mounted a vigorous challenge to the prosecution's case, arguing in substance that without the discovery of the head, no murder had been proven beyond doubt, a line of argument that the press reported with some derision. A juror's illness during the first proceedings had necessitated a retrial, which took place in Queen's County. Thorne's own account, that he had arrived at the cottage to find Mrs. Nack had already committed the act, was contradicted by the testimony of John Gother, who recounted Thorne's earlier confession in detail, and by Constantine Keene, a barber of 836 8th Avenue, who testified that Thorne had told him he had received surgical training in Germany. On the 30th of November 1897, the jury returned a verdict of guilty of murder in the first degree. The judge pronounced the sentence of death. The courtroom received the verdict in a state of considerable tension. Thorne showed no outward sign of emotion. The verdict was appealed to the New York Court of Appeals, which, in 1898, affirmed the judgment of the lower court in full. The sentence of death was to be carried out. Martin Thorne, born Martin Torzewski, sometime barber of the city of New York, was executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing Prison on the 1st of August 1898. During the months between his conviction and his execution, one further episode attracted the attention of the press. From within Queen's County Prison, Mrs. Nack had managed to convey a letter to Thorne, concealed within a sandwich and carried by another prisoner who enjoyed the privileges of a trustee. The letter, it was reported, asked Thorne to send her something with which she might end her own life. The prisoner, rather than delivering the letter as directed, took it instead to the newsroom of the New York Journal. The journal copied the letter and permitted it to continue to its intended recipient, who, according to his own subsequent statement in court, destroyed it upon receipt. He told the court that he had not wished to facilitate her death, as he loved her and desired to see her free. When asked by counsel whether he was prepared to die for her, he replied that he was. The Attorney General noted the journal's involvement in the interception of prison correspondence with displeasure. Mrs. Augusta Nack was conveyed to Auburn Prison in the state of New York on the 18th of January 1898, there to serve her sentence of 15 years at hard labour. She did not serve the full term. She was released in the summer of 1908, having served approximately 9 to 10 years of her sentence. Her return to the world was not a comfortable one. She attempted to open a shop in New York City, but was recognized almost immediately by those who had followed the case a decade earlier. The enterprise failed. She attempted again with the same result. She removed at length to New Jersey, where she lived out the remainder of her days in a state of relative and unheralded obscurity. The records do not preserve the date of her death. The case of William Guldensuppe did not fade quietly from public memory. The circulation of William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal was reported to have leapt from 300,000 to 1.5 million during the summer and autumn of 1897, as Hearst committed extraordinary resources to the story, renting Mrs. Nack's vacated apartment so that no rival reporters could enter it, deploying what he called a wrecking crew of artists, journalists, and investigators, and effectively embedding his own staff within the police investigation. The rival New York World under Joseph Pulitzer competed at every step. The methods employed, the theft of photographs, the interception of correspondence, the manufacture of details when facts ran dry, prompted later historians to identify the Guldensuppe case as one of the formative episodes in the birth of what became known as yellow journalism. The head of William Guldensuppe was never recovered. Encased in plaster of Paris and cast into the river, it remained below the waters of New York Harbour, the one piece of evidence that the defence had argued to no avail, rendered proof of murder impossible. The Murray Hill Turkish Baths continued to operate on West 42nd Street until the street widening of 1910 removed the building's ornate red sandstone steps and much of its facade. The establishment was demolished entirely in 1925. In the case records of Queen's County Court in the matter of the People against Martin Thorne, the transcript of proceedings was duly bound and preserved. It records, in the formal language of the law, the testimony of masseurs and barbers, oilcloth merchants and physicians, a Pekin duck that had been seen swimming in a blood-stained ditch at Woodside, and a woman who had hissed to her co-accused across a courtroom, in German, to say nothing. It records a verdict, a sentence, and an execution. It does not record what became of the man who was found wrapped in red and gold beside the pier at East 11th Street, nor what he might have wished for himself on that last morning in June, when Mrs. Nack aroused him early and invited him to come and see a house she had taken in the country. He had told his employer the night before that the old woman wanted him to see a place she had rented. He might not come in the next night, he had said. He was right. He never came in at all.